Firstly, I'd like to start by apologising for not being there in person. I'm so sorry that I can't make it. Unfortunately, due to COVID and isolation rules, and also, the disruptions with flights at the moment, I've had to cancel at short notice, and please accept my sincere apologies that I'm not there with you in person. I was so very much looking forward to meeting you, and can't thank Amir enough for inviting me and for being such a generous host. But I really do hope that I get to see you all in person at some other point. So I want to start by giving you a little bit of brief background about myself. So I'm an optometrist like all of you, and I work mainly in public health. So anything I talk about today comes from a very public health perspective. So what I'm going to share about myopia comes from my experience in working in the field programmatically, designing programs, and working in health systems primarily. So I want to start by sharing my affiliations. I am the chair of the Public Health Committee at the World Council of Optometry. I'm an assistant professor in international eye health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and I also work at a social enterprise called Peak Vision, where I design their global programs. So these are my disclosures, and I have nothing financial to declare. So myopia is the most common form of refractive error in children. It usually starts around the age of 8 to 10, and then it progresses through severity, through childhood and severity, so adolescence into adulthood. We know that in China and other East Asian and Southeast Asian countries, myopia begins earlier, and it's more prevalent in children as young as 5 years old. So I don't want to go into too much of this because I'm sure you all know this, but it's always good to make sure that we're all starting from the same page. Now, why does myopia matter? And it matters because we know that children with vision impairment have poor educational outcomes and are more likely to be excluded from schools. Now, one of the SDGs, SDG 4, is all around quality education. So if we're not addressing the myopia matter, then we're going to have an impact on SDG 4. So not only the direct impact with the SDG 4 in terms of correcting a child's vision, having a positive impact on school enrollment, education, attainment and learning. What we know is that by a child that wears glasses, it can reduce their odds of failing a class by 44%. A child who has vision loss is also 2 to 5 times less likely to be in formal education. Now, these are very large numbers. When we think about it, 25% of the global population is under 15 years old. So this is when we start talking public health, large numbers, mass scale. Also, in day-to-day reality, myopia affects these children. Children can't play easily, children can't socialize easily, children can't read easily. So these are the problems that we're dealing with day to day. We also know that along with the direct impact, we've got SDG 3 and SDG 5, good health and well-being also being affected. Gender equality, we also know girls and women have worse access to eye health services. So all of these things are important, and that is why it's important that we understand and address this global epidemic of myopia that's happening. When The Economist starts to talk about myopia, short-sightedness, then we really know it's a problem, and it's becoming a global problem. And what's happening is that this is starting to have an impact on productivity and the GDPs of countries. So this is a map that shows the global prevalence of myopia in different regions. Now, unfortunately, we don't have data for all the countries and all the regions yet, because data is not collected in a standardized way, definitions are not adhered to, and also there isn't equipment or human resources to do these sort of studies in a lot of places. But this is some of the data that we have globally at the moment. So in 2016, Rudnicka et al. Published a review to quantify the global variation in childhood myopia prevalence, and it took into account ethnicity, age, and the different study designs that were used. And what they found is that there are noticeable differences in prevalence by ethnicity, and these differences increase with age. Now, East Asians have the highest prevalence of myopia, reaching 80% by the age of 18, compared to black children in Africa in late adolescence, where 5.5% of 15-year-olds are affected. Also, children with predominantly who are living in urban areas are 2.6 times more to be myopic than children living in rural environments. Now, this graph shows the distribution of people with myopia and the prevalence across age groups. In 2000, the greatest number of people with myopia were between the age of 10 and 39 years. Now, just let that sink in, because that is the group that is at school, that is learning, that is becoming young adults, that are becoming leaders and pillars of our societies. This is the age group that is productive. However, the projections also suggest that through both cohort and age effects, this distribution will spread by 2050, with large numbers of people with myopia from 10 years of age all the way through to 79 years of age. So, overall, the global numbers of myopia in the year 2000, with the bulk of myopia in age groups younger than 40 years, reflects the significant lifestyle changes for children and young people over the past 10 to 25 years, especially in the large population centers of Asia. Overall, this is the trend that is estimated in a recent systematic review and meta-analysis. So what this review suggests that between 2010 and 2050, the number of people with myopia globally will increase from 1.9 billion to 5 billion, 1 billion of whom will have high myopia. So these projections were based on existing data and assumed that the current lifestyle patterns would continue, and things like time spent outdoors, amount of near work done, and that lifestyle changes will continue to spread with increasing urbanization and development. Now, there is a jury out at the moment on whether the COVID-19 pandemic will have an impact on these figures, given the increased screen time, time spent indoors, changing drastically for all age groups, especially children. With the increasing prevalence of myopia, vision impairment from uncorrected myopia is also increasing. And so that means those children who do not have access to basic eye care, do not have access to glasses, what we're seeing, that vision impairment from that is also increasing. And that is really worrying, because we know that with a simple pair of glasses, that can be avoided. So this is a snapshot of the rate of myopia seen in children based on recent studies. More recent studies indicate that myopic macular degeneration is also becoming a serious ocular health concern, where it's been reported as one of the major causes of permanent blindness in some countries. So what we've really understood from all of this so far is that there is an increasing prevalence of myopia, and that's global. And that myopia affects children from a young age, which means that vision impairment from uncorrected myopia is also increasing. So given this epidemic in myopia, there is insufficient attention from a public health perspective in terms of assessment of prevalence and preventative and possible treatments. Unfortunately, there's also a lack of consensus on the thresholds for classifying myopia and high myopia, and also the terminology, classifications, and methods that are used in epidemiological studies is not always defined in order to assess the extent and contribution of myopia to vision impairment. So, these findings, along with the lack of consensus on standard definitions for myopia and high myopia, and this insufficient attention for myopia being a public health problem, led to a global scientific meeting of myopia in March 2015. This was led by the WHO and, at that time, the Brian Holden Vision Institute. And participants at the meeting were scientific and clinical experts in myopia from 6 WHO regions, and they published a report called The Impact of Myopia and High Myopia. I thoroughly encourage you to download this report and have a read of it, because what it led to was an agreed definition of myopia and high myopia, and also a clinical definition of myopic macular degeneration, and also a call for clinical and epidemiological research on myopia using standardized methodologies, and also an evaluation of the current evidence on myopia control and strategies, which I believe is going to be the next session. So what causes myopia, and why does it progress in some children versus others? And why are some children more at risk of becoming myopic? These are all very valid questions, but they're also very complex. And I don't want to delve into this too much because this is not my expertise, but I do think that we should have a basic understanding of this. This is all very complex because there's a lot of factors that make it very difficult to disentangle the effect of the nature versus nurture argument, i.e. genetics versus the environment. And so the next few slides, I just attempt to briefly go through the different determinants of myopia and the different conclusions that are from the different studies. Now, it's now generally accepted that genetic change is too slow to explain the rapid increase in the prevalence of myopia seen over a short time in East Asia. Thus, this indicates that environmental factors are also associated with more widespread education and urbanization playing a larger role. It's become quite normal now that schools do a lot of work on screens, there's a lot of reading time, there's a lot of time spent indoors. So all of these things, it's felt, have an impact on myopia. Furthermore, the higher prevalence of myopia is not limited to a single race. It's higher in people of Chinese, Indian, and Malay origin in Singapore than in Indians in India and rural Chinese in China. So, for the sake of completeness, it's good to note that genetic factors impose a level of baseline risk of myopia, but the associations of myopia with environmental risk factors has led to the epidemic of myopia. Twin studies have also shown that genetics can explain 60 to 80% of variance in spherical equivalent refractive error and axial length. However, other studies have indicated that the genetic contribution is far less and doesn't explain the majority of cases of high myopia. Studies of genetic contributions should include evaluation of the environmental factors, aspects as factors such as time spent outdoors and near work can vary by family. There's other studies that have found that children of myopic parents have a higher prevalence of myopia, but the relative risk varies and is lower where the prevalence of myopia is high, such as in East Asia. So, emmetropization. Now, the development of an eye towards emmetropia is known as emmetropization, and this process is guided by visual input, and the mechanisms that coordinate this process are not fully understood. So I won't dwell on this too much, but it's thought that by some that the relative peripheral defocus encourages the growth of the eyeball and as a consequence increased axial length and myopia. This also forms the basis of some myopia management interventions that you'll hear about. So basically, hyperopic defocus, which is common in corrected myopic eyes, can increase ocular growth, whereas myopic defocus, especially when it's imposed over a large area of retina, can slow axial elongation. The projected increase in myopia and high myopia are widely considered to be driven by environmental factors, nurture, principally lifestyle changes resulting from a combination of decreased time outdoors and increased near work. And we've definitely seen a lot of this over the last few years. Among environmental factors, so-called high-pressure educational systems, especially at very young ages, such as in countries like Singapore, Korea, Taiwan, and China, may be a causative lifestyle change, as it may be the excess use of near electronic devices, which we all know is very, very common now. We all do it. We're all on our mobile phones most of the time. In fact, I'm not there right now, but I assure you there's someone in the audience who is probably looking at their mobile phone right now. Other proposed causes include high light levels which may be directly related to time outdoors, with peripheral hyperopia in the myopic eye, encouraging axial growth. And there's also diet. So these next two slides summarize the different pieces of evidence linked to near work and outdoor time and the theories for myopia onset and progression. As a strategy to prevent the onset of myopia, outdoor time is now recommended and is also built into some school curriculums. There's also been some work to try outdoor classrooms or greenhouse classrooms in some places. There's different theories around why spending time outdoors is protective and whether there are seasonal effects too. Now, generally advocating for children to spend more time outdoors has a positive impact on child and their general well-being and social interactions. So regardless of how and why it reduces the risk of developing myopia, it's encouraged that children spend more time outdoors. And I know that this is going to be discussed in the next session. Now, having heard all of that, I want to bring you back to your region, to your area, to understand the prevalence of refractive errors in the Middle East. And so there was a very recent systematic review and meta-analysis, which is a really great resource for some of this to understand what's happening in the region. And this is a table to show the prevalence of myopia compared to hyperopia and astigmatism, and it's stratified by age and gender. And so the results of this showed that that the prevalence of myopia was 4% in less than children who are in less than or equal to children who are 15, and 30% in those over 15 years. And when you think about the male to female ratio, this is the data. So in females less than or equal to 15 years of age, it was 3.5% and it was 3.5% in males and 4.2% in females, respectively. And when it got to children over 15 years of age, the prevalence was 31.7% in males and 31.9%. So there isn't really a significant difference between that. Now, the study concluded that, I'm just going to move this so that you can see the explanation there. So a general overview of the results from this meta-analysis showed that Middle Eastern countries are more prevalent to have hyperopia than other parts of the world. Now, although the prevalence of myopia in adults is higher than that of hyperopia, the prevalence of hyperopia in adults in Middle East is more than the rest of the world. Now, the authors concluded that it may be because this region is still catching up with urbanization and development and lifestyle changes and environmental changes. However, there's also racial differences of this region in the world, in this region. And the economic conditions are very different. So it still is really important to think about all these things. And I say this because something that happened, in 2020 changed all our worlds. So while this meta-analysis showed that myopia is not as prevalent as other regions, it is still increasing. It is still becoming higher. And there's evidence for that from other countries as well. Now, if we think about what's changed in our world, this is what changed. COVID-19 changed all our lives. Lockdown meant that we were spending all our time indoors. Children were having school online. Children were not going outside. Children were spending much more time on screens because apart from schooling and education, they were also socializing online. They were watching TV more. They were playing more video games. They were making TikTok videos. They were using Instagram. So everything changed in 2020. So we don't know what's happened since then. We don't know the impact that has had on myopia. Lifestyle changes, outdoor time decreased, indoor time increased, and exercise time decreased. Now, just have a look at these graphs. Look at that stark difference between what's happened. If you just think of outdoor time, look at how much that reduced. If you look at indoor time on weekdays and weekends, look at that difference. And the biggest difference, look at exercise time. I mean, that in itself is telling of what our lifestyles had become. Screen time. Think of the different things that were happening. Before COVID, a lot of time, majority would be TV. But during COVID, there were video games, there were computers for learning, computers for searching things, a tablet for gaming, a cell phone for learning, a cell phone for surfing the internet. All these things are and will have an impact. We know that weekday time versus weekend time, what people were doing has changed considerably. And unfortunately, what's also happened is that some of these lifestyle changes have remained. We are still spending a lot more time on our screens, and children are doing a lot more things indoors. And if you think about the younger children whose school life was just beginning as the pandemic hit, what they knew for the first 2 years of their schooling life was based on Zoom screens, Microsoft Teams. Their schooling was done through screens. So that is the world they knew and understood. And so the impact now is to change that behavior. How do we encourage children to spend more time outdoors, to do less screen work, to exercise more? And that's a challenge we're going to face. Again, total near work time and the change during COVID-19. Now, this is all basic data from some surveys that were done in Hong Kong, India, etc. So none of this is published yet, but this is just that things that were done early on during the pandemic, and then this data was collected to analyze to understand the impact of what happened. So what are the potential consequences, and why should we worry about myopia? Uncorrected refractive error, and in specific, myopia is going to increase substantially. Cataract and glaucoma attributable to myopia is likely to increase. And blindness and vision impairment due to myopic macular degeneration and myopic retinopathy in adults will increase substantially. So you have to remember, when a child is myopic, they will remain myopic, and they will then, once progressing into adulthood, the severity of their myopia will increase and put them more at risk of other conditions. What it will also mean is that we need resources for refractive and specialist services, glasses, contact lenses, myopia management resources, and then complications will also increase. So we're going to need to learn how to manage that. So all of these things need to be thought of when we start thinking about this global myopia epidemic and why we should worry about it now. The economic consequences are stark. The global cost of distance uncorrected refractive error it was predicted to be $202 billion per year in 2009. And of this, myopia was the main cause. The global cost of myopia from lost productivity due to vision impairment from uncorrected myopia and myopia macular degeneration was estimated to be $244 billion in 2015. Now, these numbers are huge, and sometimes when numbers are huge, we may not understand them. So it's important to bring it back to what it means for us. And if you think about that child who is myopic at a young age in school and continues to progress, and the severity of their myopia increases, and if they don't access the right treatment and the right sort of healthcare, it could mean that they're not able to get a job. Or this child may grow up with very little social interactions, which could then have an impact on their general well-being, social well-being, and their mental health. So it's just always important to bring it back to the patient that's sitting in front of you. And often enough, when we're practicing, what we forget about is the other aspects of this patient sitting in front of us. And so it's important to remember that from a public health perspective. And so these numbers are important to keep in mind, but it's also important to keep in mind what this means for this patient that's sitting in front of you. So, in summary, we know that myopia is the most common type of refractive error in children, and it usually starts from a young age. Now, there's geographic variations in the distribution of refractive errors, and specifically myopia, we know that it's urbanization, environmental factors, etc., that has an impact. But what we do know is that there is an epidemic of myopia, and that it is changing regionally. It's no longer an East Asian problem. We also know that genetics and environmental factors play a role in the development of myopia. However, we also know that it's widely accepted that genetic contribution is considered small, and there is consensus that genes may determine the susceptibility to environmental factors. So the risk factors that are there because of genetics are increased maybe because of that. And also the genetic contribution doesn't explain the majority of cases of high myopia. There are lots of resources out there. These are some that I would point you to. The World Council of Optometry has the myopia micro website, and I strongly encourage you to look on there. There's documentation there that you can use on standard of care upon management. There's some multimedia resources that you can use. There's webinars, etc., that you can tap into. There's also the International Myopia Institute that released a number of white papers that are also very useful to reference and for you to gain a better understanding of the problem and management techniques as well. And then finally, there's the BHVI, Global Myopia Center, which also has resources such as the myopia calculator, which is really easy to use and gives you an idea of what you're dealing with when you've got a patient there. Again, I'm really sorry that I couldn't be there in person. I really wish the conference goes well today, and I wish you all the very best. Please get in touch with me if you have any questions, if you want to share your experiences. And I do hope that I sincerely get to meet all of you very soon. Thank you.